like to resume. I'll ask first of all whether there are any other boundaries within section 5 that anyone wants to talk about. Mr. Perkins.
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to respond to some of the comments that were made, I think by Mr. Linus before the break, talking about back to section 5, boundaries 32 to 35, namely, but probably applies to other areas as well. I think Miss Healy-Brown mentioned that it was purportedly meeting the purpose of purpose 4 in the green belt. We would unsurprisingly contend that it doesn't meet that, but however, this is based around the idea that York is a heritage asset, which is understandable. We've seen appeals dismissed in the green belt for housing sites for heritage reasons. I'll reiterate my previous point that the council previously allocated this land as an area of search, and nothing has physically changed in the meantime, and I don't understand why it's suddenly different now. A heritage asset, by its very nature, is not changed. It's protected. So the council have previously assessed this area of land and said the boundary should be at New Lane because the impacts of heritage in this particular area are not sufficiently significant to warrant keeping this area as greenbelt land. And I say keep the area as greenbelt land in line with what Mr. Linus was saying about expanding the development area. It's not expanding, it's setting. It's not being set, it's not clear. The location of the greenbelt boundary in this area is something that I started my comments with earlier before the break, and I was carefully said locating the greenbelt, not relocating the greenbelt boundary. The difference in physical distance on the ground is literally 200 metres to the main road, which is the obvious clear boundary in that location. In terms of purpose 4, which is what the council are pinning their reasons for not amending the boundary in this area, not setting the boundary at New Lane, was that the heritage reason outweighed any other reasons to set the boundary at New Lane. But there are no conservation areas, no listed buildings, and there's no views into York or towards the Minster, which is the main asset, from this site, and that amplifies what was previously decided by the council in relation to setting the land as, allocating the land as safeguarded land previously. And to reiterate some of the points that Mr. Pilcher made earlier, we're setting the greenbelt boundary, but that doesn't mean that it becomes allocated for housing land. It becomes countryside land or white land or whatever other allocation that council want to allocate land, and that would be then under the control of development management policies. So if it were to be set at New Lane and Malton Road, as we believe it should be, the land within that boundary would not be greenbelt, but it would be countryside land, and wherein it would be assessed against development management policies, which the council can set in their own way. And likewise, one of the reasons quoted for setting the boundary adjacent to the rear boundaries of residential dwellings was that the land to the east of that proposed boundary by the council partially includes some flood zone land, which it doesn't because that's been changed by the EA, and partially includes some of the green wedge, which again I think it was Mr. Nakas or I can't remember her name next to me, but sorry, Catherine Dukes, Miss Dukes' comments earlier, which was that's not a purpose of the green belt. It's a green wedge is a separate policy, which would be DM policies as well. So again, that would control development in the country or hypothetical countryside area, which would be out with the green belt, but would be within the countryside. Therefore, would be controlled by separate development management policies. I think it's clear that we need to go back to the fundamentals of setting the green belt boundaries at these clear defensible boundaries. And if you've got an option between a rear boundary or a road that's 200 metres away, which is the clear permanent boundary, why would you not choose the road when you're setting the boundary? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Linus?
Thank you, sir. I'll ask Ms. Healy-Brown to comment, but just to confirm that, as we said before, the judgments here are to be based upon the up-to-date methodology and analysis that's contained in Annex 3. Second point is that the analysis that's contained in pages A3, 475 through to 480 don't focus exclusively on purpose 4, but cover other purposes as well. I'll invite you to read that analysis in full. Third point, as far as purpose 4 is concerned, again, the analysis has been set out in full, including in relation to compactness, that the land should be kept permanently open as part of a wider view of a dense, compact city in an open or rural landscape. And it should be kept permanently open to maintain the scale, identity and distribution of settlements and districts, to constrain development from coalescing and maintaining a connection to an open and historic setting. So again, there's a straightforward difference of view about how Purpose 4 should be approached, which you'll need to resolve. Perhaps I can ask Ms Healy-Brown to explain further, please, particularly the relationship between wedge and openness, if that's relevant here.
Thank you. So yes, Mr Perkins talked about what has and hasn't changed, and I think it is the methodology that has been confirmed in terms of green belt, and particularly what that means in relation to Purpose 4. And that is then reflected in the criteria that are used in the assessment, which is set out from page 475 in relation to this particular location. Mr Perkins talked about the lack of heritage features, which would be criterion to landmark monuments, and we agree with that isn't applicable here. As been suggested, I invite you to look at the rest of the assessment in detail, but it does mean that it does criterion 1, which is compactness, and criterion 3, landscape and setting, are the ones that are particularly relevant in this case. We know in terms of the green wedge, I know in the matter statement it was suggested that the council was saying that the whole of the site is within the green wedge. We actually acknowledge within the assessment that that's not the case. It isn't all within the green wedge, and that has been had regard to as you look at the landscape and setting.
Thank you. Go on. We'll have one more exchange, Mr Perkins. Carry on.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. Just quickly, I think the green wedge point, it shouldn't really be relevant because we're talking about green belt today and it's a separate policy. Mr Linus, I think it was mentioned about keeping the site open, and I'll trust you, your professional judgment, to go and make your own call on as you complete your site visits. And I think Ms Healy-Brown mentioned the criteria-based assessment, and I don't propose to regurgitate all the comments from my written reps, and I'm sure you will have a look at those, and as you're unsurprised, we disagree with the council's opinion. So thank you.
I understand, Mr Perkins. Thank you. Go on.
I think just one point. I would say the green wedge is relevant because that is part of the historic form of York, which is therefore relevant in assessment against Purpose 4.
Understood. Mr Natkus, your nameplate is on end.
Thank you, sir. It was just the comments just before the break from Mr Linus, and unfortunately I couldn't see the plan that he was pointing to from here, but he indicated, I think he stated that a number of the objectors were seeking large changes in this area to release large parts of land, but in reality, I mean, well, for clarity, I'm only seeking change in one area of this, so you don't, it isn't an all or nothing, but equally, there's 2 points really from it. Is one of them, ST9, is an allocation. It's not an inner boundary issue. The council are allocating the land to the north of Monk's Cross for housing because they think it's acceptable. So it sort of implied, well, if you take that and these changes, there'll be an impact on the compactness of the city. But that's not the case because that's a development that's been proposed. Equally, I think there was also a comment which I think was almost saying, well, if you look at all these together, cumulatively, it would change the compactness of the city. Well, there's no assessment of that anywhere. There's nothing anywhere that looks at these changes cumulatively or says, well, these changes X, Y, and Z would impact the compactness of the city. It's a case of assessing each of these boundaries on its merits because that's what the council's done. So my case is the piece of land in particular that I'm talking about has no impact on the compactness of the city because of the development all the way around it. And again, I think that's something that you'll pick up from the site visit.
So do you say then, Mr Natkus, that there's no evidence from the council about the cumulative effect on the compactness of the city?
Well, that's my understanding of this, that in terms of compactness, they assess each boundary individually to determine whether that boundary would have an impact.
Do you say that, therefore, we're not entitled to reach a judgment on that?
I don't believe there's any evidence in front of you that would say, if your view was, if after listening today you considered that the evidence of everybody was that there shouldn't really be a gap at I think it's ST9, isn't it? ST8, sorry, that there shouldn't be a gap at ST8, that the finger of development Miss Duke said was acceptable, and the logical boundary is to follow Malton Road, if you consider that all of those individual acceptable, there's no evidence to say that cumulatively that would have an impact upon that part of York and the compactness of the city.
I'll put it another way. If we were to agree with some or all of you about where the red line should go, or perhaps it's a green line, whichever colour we choose to paint it, would cumulative effect be something that we would need to consider in your view?
I think when you look at the council's methodology, I think the compactness comes into the heritage element of it. And I don't think you would, because I think if you agreed with the individual views that these pieces of land didn't have... Okay, so I'm just trying to think of a better way to put it. If you felt that each of these parcels of land individually didn't have an impact on compactness, I'm not sure how cumulatively they then would have an impact on compactness, because if any of them individually does, the council's evidence is that that should then put it into the green belt. So I'm struggling to see how you would make a decision at each one, because they're not linked together. They're separate, so I don't think you would have to consider it.
Okay, so therefore, in your view, and tell me if I've got this wrong, that when Mr. Linus held up the plan that I appreciate you couldn't see, but invited us to step back and look at what the overall impact on compactness might be, you say that's not relevant.
I think that is it relevant? I think you would come to the same conclusion, is where I get to. So it may be relevant, but I think I'm struggling to see how you would indicate that each of these would not have an impact on compactness, but then cumulatively they would, because if, for example, the argument, I didn't see the boundary, but if it was that it should go all the way to the ring road, and then you felt that actually that would extend and it did have an impact on compactness, then you would just say, well, that piece of land should remain in the green belt. However, the thin slither of land between ST8 doesn't impact on compactness. You would then exclude that. You wouldn't say, well, I've considered it all cumulatively and it does have an impact, so I'll put everything in the green belt. Does that make sense?
No.
No. I think I'm just saying that you would have to just judge each site on its merits. And I'm really struggling to see how you would come to an impact that cumulatively it would affect compactness. I think if one element did have that adverse impact, you would just leave that parcel of land within the green belt. And that might be the piece of land I'm talking about. It might be the piece of land the gentleman opposite is. It might be the piece of land that Mr. Johnson's talking about. But I think that you then wouldn't say, well, everything has to be in the green belt because cumulatively that bit tips it over. I think you would just have to analyse each one individually.
Thank you, Mr. Knapp, because I'll come to you in a moment, Mr. Lannis, but Mr. Pulcher. No.
Thank you, sir. I absolutely see Mr. Linus's point, and the point that you're making that if we set the boundary, as I might set the boundary, is that you're going to make the assumption that we're not just going to sit on the land and leave it fallow for another 20, 30, 50 years. We're going to make an application to deliver housing. And if everyone takes the same strategy, you're going to say the whole area gets filled in. That may be significant. So I totally see your point, and I think you probably do have to consider that if that boundary were all the way out there and all the way around, that might have an impact on the compactness of the city, or it might have an impact on Huntington as a character, as a space, because you would significantly increase the size of it. And I've read the Huntington neighbourhood plan, and none of those people are here today, but they would be absolutely hopping mad at the idea of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be considered, because the framework is asking the City of York to consider all reasonable alternatives when they're plan making. Now, we don't want to go right back into methodology, but they might have considered these boundaries before using exceptional circumstances, because obviously it's all simultaneous, the first time we're ever creating this boundary, and the time when they're asking you to release 4,000, 5,000, well, no, it's probably 6,000 or 7,000 plots out in the general extent of the greenbelt. So if you had done this sort of urban fringe expansion, it may well be that there's less impact on the historic city than if you put it up in multiple settlements in different places. Now, we're just talking about that's methodology. It's something you say we might have discussed in phase one. Let's not discuss it again. But I would basically concede to your point, sir, against my wishes, is that yes, it probably does need to be considered. And that's why, if I could choose anything, we would have had our land developed and safeguarded or something in the 90s or the 80s, because by adding ST8, we're making a significant difference to the shape of Huntington. And I'd love to have got our land through long before that, because I think it's more logical, but because you do fundamentally change the shape of Huntington if you go all the way over to the new North Lane roundabout, whereas you might say, well, I've looked at it, I think yours is a reasonable change at number 20, but it should go down the side in order to keep the shape the same. And that comes to the issue of potential shapes of settlements and sustainable patterns of development, etc. But I don't think the evidence base has looked at one shape of Huntington, another shape of Huntington, etc. It's used exceptional circumstances to release ST8. In phase 3, they nearly said that they thought it was an urban extension of a shopping centre, which I think in the end, Mr. Johnson might comment, we realised that ST8 is still part of Huntington. It's part of the Huntington Parish Plan. Monks Cross is part of Huntington. There's a tie through, so I don't think they're saying it's an urban extension from a shopping centre. It's an urban extension of Huntington that, due to politics, got shifted 90 to 180 yards away from the existing part of Huntington to help the political elephant in the room we don't talk about. So ST8 changes everything for sites like ours, because it changes the whole massing and the scale of the whole of the city. So I would concede to Mr. Linus's point and your point that should it be considered that if you choose a different boundary, you're changing fundamentally the whole character of that area. But my only thing that I would say is I'm not sure if they've got enough evidence to look at it, and I definitely don't think they've got enough evidence to say, had we done all our development in this area, where figure F7 says is reasonable, there's not a necessity for Greenbelt, had they done that, you might not have needed a site that I think is not particularly great, like ST14. So there's a sort of relative balance, and when you're testing for soundness, you're always testing soundness against the framework, but also against all alternative strategies that could have been pursued. So unfortunately, it comes back round in circles in terms of if you're setting your inner boundary for the first time, have you looked at all the other potential things that you could have done? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pilchip. Mr. Perkins, I'll hear from you and then I'll come back to the council, I think.
Thank you, sir. I think just in relation to the comments that were made about the cumulative impacts, we would agree with Mr. Nax's comments about each boundary should be assessed on its merits. If you weren't to do that, you may as well just allocate the whole area of York as Greenbelt and just say, we're going to restrict development as much as possible. The heritage asset in the town centre is within the Greenbelt and it's there, but it's fine, it's all Greenbelt, and don't bother setting the boundaries, because that, coming back to the purpose of what we're doing today, is where the line is going, and where we draw the line should be on a site-by-site basis, and using your professional judgment to say, does this site meet the purpose of the Greenbelt, and what is the best location to prevent unrestricted sprawl and to assist in safeguard of the countryside. So I think that is the key purposes in relation to the cumulative impact that have been mentioned. So I think it is something that would, by assessing each site individually, you would automatically assess the cumulative impact. But again, going back to my previous point, I keep reiterating, we're not amending the location, we're setting the location. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Mr. Linus.
Thank you, sir. As far as Mr. Pilcher's points are concerned, I don't want to go over old ground again, because we have all spent enough of our lives looking at sustainability appraisal, alternatives, assessments at earlier part of the examination, where the Council explained at a strategic level how the iterative SA process involved looking at different spatial distributions, different approaches to green belt policy, as well as strategic sites. And it's not necessary to go through that ground. We say that alternatives have been properly assessed. As for the approach to the boundaries, and yes, obviously we have looked at the boundaries on individual boundary sections. We've set out our judgments on those. We don't think you should be going further on each of those boundary sections, and we've said, and we've given reasons related to purpose 4 and the other purposes relative to each of those boundary sections, and we stand by those. But it must still be relevant to stand back once you've done that and say, well, if one accepts the approach that's being advocated by developers who have appeared here today to make points about their individual sites, we've been very quick to support what others are saying about other stretches of the boundary. It must be relevant to look at what the effect of adopting all of their individual judgments would be when compared with the effect of adopting the judgments that have been set out in detail in the Council's evidence. Beyond that, I don't think there's anything more we need to say, because nothing more has been raised about individual sites.
Thank you, that's helpful. I'd like to move on. Anything else on inner boundary section 5? In which case, I'm going to turn the page and go to inner boundary section 6. That runs from 1 to 23. Ties on to what we have. Sorry, Ms. Dukes, did I not see your nameplate? Forgive me.
So have we skipped over boundaries 1 to 15 up to 20 of part 5? We started talking about boundary 20.
We weren't doing it in order. I was just doing it in however they came up. If you want to talk about anything in 1 to 20, then yeah, go ahead.
Please, sir. I did go to the back of the queue in the supermarket line, so having not actually wanted to skip the line, but yeah, no, if we can go back, because I would like to talk about the sections of the boundary around New Earswick. In particular, I've got that many documents open because of how many documents. I need more than one screen now. Let me find the map. Right, I have to say, in reading all the proposed modifications, all the addendums, and getting lost in the myriad of all these changes that have been going on, the methodology seems to have become slightly confused and woolly, and there are now some real inconsistencies with the way that the council's actually applied the methodology to setting the boundaries. And so I think we just need to look at some of the conclusions the council has reached. For example, one I've noticed is in relation to, I can't find the boundary, proposed modification. Which document have I got open? Get rid of that one. Here we go. No. I've got 3 versions of Outlook open. Which one are we on now? Right, so bear with. Right, so section 5, boundary 9, which goes round Joseph Rowntree School. That's now subject to a proposed modification. I did have it open a minute ago. Where it is? Oh, here we go, 81. Proposed modification 81. Now, there's a little bit of an anomaly here in how suddenly the council's decided in this proposed modification, way down the line in the preparation of the plan, to exclude the playing fields. To the west of to the east of the playing fields, there's actually, and the north side of the playing fields, there's actually really clearly defined boundaries in terms of hedges that have been there for decades. So, and those buildings are actually fairly recent. They're only 20 or so years old by comparison to the actual field boundaries. So to suddenly move the boundary so it follows the edge of the buildings rather than following a field boundary that defines the curtilage of the buildings seems slightly at odds, especially going back in the depths of time, because even going back to the 1990s and the examinations to do with the South Rydale local plan and the North Yorkshire County Council green belt plans, these sites that I'm wanting to talk about were all discussed at those examinations. There are inspectors' conclusions from those times in relation to where boundaries should be set and the character of the land. The land itself hasn't actually changed. The land is there, the schools have been there, the boundaries have been there, the playing fields have been there, the hedges, the woodland, the rivers, nothing has changed. So suddenly for there to be a change in conclusion when there's been that consistency going back, it just seems slightly at odds. And that inconsistency actually flows through this proposed modification document from 2021, which is the document 59H, topic paper for the proposed mods, because what we see is if you flick through all the proposed modifications, the way the council's actually treated and dealt with areas of curtilage and open space or car parking or playing fields or recreation or just things that are actually associated with the building or else have a man-made use and an urban related use, and I'll come back to that point, it's inconsistent through those proposed modifications. So we've got some parks that are to be excluded from the green belt, some parks are to be included, some open space to be excluded, some open space to be included. And the inconsistency is in where the boundaries actually lie in relation to those land uses. Now, just in terms of green belt and how you categorise, one of the important features of green belt should be about assisting the safeguarding of countryside from encroachment. And the inconsistency that I seem to be spotting is in relation to land uses that are predominantly related to urban land uses and urban living and population. So things like playing fields associated with a school or a park that's associated with people's enjoyment, defined by hedges and walls and car parks. They're all urban uses. They're not part of the rural character of the countryside or open countryside. And so we've already encroached into those spaces. So there is no need to protect them from further development or to suggest that they form part of the green belt, because they are already clearly not part of the green belt by simply their character, quite simply their character and appearance. So something like proposed modification 81, I really have got quite strong feelings that should be excluded, and it isn't a correct modification. It doesn't follow the council's methodology, and it isn't consistent with the approach that's been taken decade after decade in terms of dealing with where you draw a green belt boundary. So yes, so P81, if we can look at that one, please, specifically as whether that's been drawn in the right place. So that's to do with open spaces. Now, the other thing that I'd like to talk about, as well as the inconsistency, how open spaces, recreation car parks and what have you been dealt with, particularly proposed modifications, is then in relation to these fingers and the green wedges. Again, if I can go back to the inspector's report from the 1995, right, what page am I on? 69. So I'm looking at the York Green Belt Local Plan Report on Objections to the Plan, prepared in January 1994, and this is the inspector's report. And in relation to, I'm going to talk about boundaries 11 to 15, which is basically the green wedge that comes along the river, along Willow Bank. I know that we have talked about it, but I think this is actually the appropriate time to do so in detail rather than the actual principle. I'm just clicking to the page I found. Right, so in relation to that boundary, the inspectors at the time, they actually concluded that that river corridor right, if I can just read, it's easier. Whilst the site makes a contribution to the pleasant landscape character of the riverside area, they do not form an essential part of the green wedge of countryside between Huntington and New Earswick. Their exclusion from the green belt would therefore not lead to an encroachment into the countryside, harm to the setting of York, or the coalescence of settlements.
Sorry, could you give me the document reference number for that, and the paragraph reference would be really helpful as well if you have that.
Right, I'm not sure this is part of the evidence, is it? These previous documents.
You tell me, you're reading it out.
Right, well, it's one that I happen to have a library of all the York Greenbelt documents, including the 1945 plan, which I'm rather proud to have because it's very old.
I think there have been. I think other people have brought them in, like George Wright.
He will have done, won't
he?
Yes.
Definitely made detailed reference to the long, torrid history, and I think they are on the library.
I will be able to find the reference, I just don't have it to hand, so it's just because of the amount of documents I have.
Do you know the paragraph reference number? And if it's not in the examination library, if we could have it added, please, that would assist us.
So it's electronic page 69. If I can just scroll back to it.
Which document are you actually reading from, Mr.
Don't make me go back to the first page. Let me just find the paragraph and then I can flick back again. Right, so we have, it's section C48 and C49 that refer to the River Foss at Huntington.
Yeah, of which document though, Ms. Duke? Sorry.
Hang on, if we can work backwards, just because I'm going to lose it again. I don't want to take up more time than necessary. And then we're on paper page 54 and 53, 50, no, that's the other one. All right, start at page 54, paragraph section C48, and I'm reading from the York Greenbelt Local Plan, Report on Objections to the Plan, January 1994, and this is the inspector's report.
Ah, right, it's EX/OTH/3A.
Thank you.
It's in the other examination documents.
Forgive me, I didn't catch that, Mr.
Yes,
Linus.
EX/OTH for other/3A. I suspect it's also contained within Mr. Wright's voluminous appendices, but you'll have to look through a 1,000-page PDF to find it.
Thank you. I mean, the point is there's a consistency here going back further than this examination and through all the previous draft versions of the local plan in how to actually assess greenbelt boundaries and define greenbelt boundaries and how land contributes either to the urban environment or else the rural countryside. And I think some of those conclusions and some of that thinking has been lost, even though it's well established. Greenbelts have been around since the 1940s. Methodologies, thought processes, it's all there. It's all fairly well established. So to suddenly deviate from that and try and apply greenbelt policy as a means of achieving other policy objectives, I just don't think it's an appropriate use of the policy. So in terms of boundaries 11 to 15, which is the slither of riverbank that actually extends into New Earswick, is between New Earswick and Huntington, it's a river corridor. It's not that sits amongst two urban edges. It isn't part of the wider open countryside. There is no... it's already characterised by the urban development around it. We're not an open countryside, and that's the conclusions that have previously been reached. So I'd just like, please, if that point could be considered for its exclusion. And also, again, that inconsistency, because there are in the proposed modifications green wedges, green slithers that have also been excluded, which includes, which one was it? Too many documents, too many pages. Is it 95? Proposed mod 95. Yes, it is. Oh no, 94. It's 94, Scarcroft allotments. again, you've got an area of green that's been excluded. And I just wonder how that relationship, the character, its form, its character, the feeling of enclosure, how that might differ from sites, from the boundaries 11 to 15, because they essentially have the same feeling of urbanness, if I can make a term up. And actually, I just need to go back. So that's the fingers. So just to go back to the open space, there's also just another anomaly in these proposed modifications, which is borne out by the one at the school. Did I say 81? Thank you. I'm just looking at proposed modification 87, because there is actually another allocation that's laid over the top. So for Joseph Rowntree School, it's coloured in yellow. And also, I'm just looking at Heslington, proposed modification 87, it's the same, it's coloured yellow. So we've now got a green belt boundary that sits over the top of a different designation, which has a different policy applying to it that would allow for the creation of a policy conflict. So I just think there's some tensions that have arisen that I don't think have been addressed.
Mr. Linus?
Right.
Perhaps we could, can we just start with PM87? Can you just enlighten me as to what the yellow hatching means?
I think the yellow is education, and the base map that shows the yellow will be from the original proposals map, which is why it's still shown on there with the modification over the previous proposal.
Okay, that's helpful. Carry on. There was a fair bit in there that you'll need to respond to.
Yes, sir. I'm just checking on the proposals map. It's it is education. It says educational establishment, including playing fields. Just a general point to begin with. We've heard reference to a local plan inspector's report from 1994. I think we just have to reiterate the point that we're looking at judgments that are set out in an up-to-date document based on an up-to-date methodology. So one must look at the judgments that are reached on each area of the boundary by reference to that up-to-date methodology based on factors that apply on the ground as they are now. As for the various points that were raised, there are a number of skips along the boundary, but I think the first one related to the Joseph Rowntree School, which is section 5, boundary 9, and it's covered on A3, page 396. I think reference was made to that as a proposed mod, but it's actually reflected in the analysis in the annex anyway. And the reason for that, which Ms Healy-Brown can explain, was actually to help ensure consistency with the approach taken on other sites by drawing the boundary around the buildings rather than around the playing fields as well. This isn't about consistency with an old methodology, which appeared to be what Ms Dukes was referring to. We're actually proposing that modification to ensure consistency with the judgments that were reached applying the up-to-date methodology. As for other sites that were mentioned, I think the next one related to a site that was raised in Ms Duke's hearing statement, which is section 5, boundaries 11 to 15, and that starts on A3, page 408. And I can ask Ms Healy-Brown to explain the rationale for the setting of the boundary in that location briefly. We've already, I think we've dealt with the final site that she mentioned in terms of the washing over of the education allocations. That leaves the boundary section 11 to 15 at section 5.
Thank you. And just to go back to modification 81 around Joseph Rowntree School, Just to confirm, as Mr Liner said, it is consistent with the application of the Greenbelt methodology. Elsewhere, I'll pause briefly. We've not had this for a while. Thank you. You will recall similar applications of the methodology around St Peter's School, around M4 Barracks, Queen Elizabeth Barracks, amongst others. So it is consistent with how this has been applied in other locations. And indeed, yesterday we talked about York Sports Club as another example of this as well. That's all I intend to say on proposed modification 81. So moving to Inner Greenbelt Boundary Section 5, Boundary 11 to 15, which is in Ms Duke's matter statement. So the methodology that we are looking at now, rather than looking at anything from previous Greenbelt local plan or previous assessments that may have taken place at that time, probably are getting quite familiar with the three purposes as they are applied here. The assessment form clearly states in this instance that the land does not contribute to purposes 1 and 3, sprawl and encroachment. However, it does contribute to purpose 4, and that is due to its role in maintaining the separation between New Earswick and Huntingdon. The separation between the settlements is important to ensure historic identity, and the scale of, within the city is protected in relation to this aspect of purpose 4. So again, if you look on page 408, the reference Mr Linus gave, the summary of that assessment, it is in particular in relation to criterion 1 of purpose 4.
Thank you. Ms Dukes, was there anything you wanted to say to that?
No, sir, thank you.
We did talk about this particular sliver of land as an example, I think, when we were discussing methodology at a previous hearing session, didn't we? I'm not imagining that, am I? We did, didn't we? Yeah, okay. That's helpful, thank you. Anything else on inner boundary section 5? Mr Perkins.
Thank you, sir. Just a quick point, more of a general comment about the principle of setting the boundaries. We'd like to spot Ms Duke's comments where it would appear that the council are utilising Greenbelt policies to achieve other policy objectives, namely trying to protect green wedges through the ruse of the Greenbelt. We accept that by the nature of the land of a green wedge, it would appear to be dovetail into the uses of Greenbelt land. However, they are different policies and they don't need to overlap fully. For example, a green wedge could fall within a countryside area rather than having to constitute Greenbelt land. And I think in terms of an up-to-date judgment, in relation to an up-to-date methodology in assessing each parcel of land individually, I think it just goes back to the fundamentals of the individual sites and looking at those sites on the ground and saying what is the purpose of this particular piece of land, where is the logical boundary, and use a common sense approach in that matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Perkins. Yeah, I understand the point you make. Was there anything you wanted to come back to?
Just very briefly, sir, the fact that land may be identified as green wedge does not preclude consideration under the question of openness for green belt purposes. We've applied the methodology as set out, which looks at whether the land needs to remain open, and the fact that land is part of a green wedge may be relevant to that consideration, applying the methodology that we set out.
Good. Can we move on to inner boundary section 6? I think so. This has elements 1 to 23. Again, I've got no particular concern about dealing with them in order, but does anyone have anything they want to say about these? Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you, sir. This is largely to do with our previous conversations with respect to the strategic site ST7. And without going back over the points, you'll recall, hopefully in phase 3, matter 4, is that the various developers of ST7 made representations to, in effect, extend the size of ST7, which may have a bearing on the gap that exists between ST7 and the existing built-up area. Just with respect to the boundaries in that particular case then, so if I'm looking at the appendix pages A3, 519 and 520 together, what we've got in boundaries 9 all the way through to 20, what the plan on the following page at A3520 doesn't show you is the proposed allocation ST7, but if you're looking at the coloured map there on 520, that white area is in effect where it then abuts the area retaining the rural setting, which is the lighter brown colour. That is in effect the eastern edge of ST7. So if I'm not losing you here, sir, is that the allocation in effect is the white land, and then you've got this intervening area between ST7 and the built-up form. What I think I'm saying on behalf of the developers is that the boundaries 9 through to 20 collectively are boundaries that we can work with as Greenbelt boundaries, but potentially if our point on ST7 needing to be slightly larger and extending westwards, I'll try that again, westwards, which would close the gap slightly, then an alternative Greenbelt boundary would be that shown on almost map 20, which will be to follow the eastern edge of ST7. So in effect, where the boundary starts on number 9, boundary number 9, is that you would actually not go to the west, but you'd turn east at that point and just follow the outer boundary of ST7. Now, what that would essentially mean is that we still have a standalone settlement, but we've got this green gap between the site, which is either going to be green belt or a strategic gap. It's not a die-in-the-ditch point, quite frankly. We think we would work better with a strategic gap because we may have items of infrastructure to put in that gap, but it's there as an alternative for you to consider. As I say, I think our starting point is that we can work with the boundaries 9 through to 20, but should you decide that ST7 could be larger, as we've requested, then it may be appropriate to consider an alternative Greenbelt boundary. Hopefully, sir, that made sense. Well, and if I may, sir, is that Mr. Napkis has got a slightly different view on that, so it might be wise for him to go before we get the councillor to respond.
Can I just, oh, sorry. Can I just note we did discuss these issues with regard to ST7 and phase 3.
Yeah, I'll hear from Mr. Natkus first. Mr. Natkus.
Thank you, sir. It was just on the back of that, because obviously we were representing that site as well, that at the time you'll remember there was quite a debate about the gap, which I have no intention of going over again, but it was just a point of a technical point that you may decide that the boundary of ST7 remains the same, but the land in between the settlement and ST7 shouldn't be in the green belt. So I think Mr. Johnson was talking about ST7 increasing, but you could actually come to because we did talk about that as a point if that land's needed. So if that is needed, I think then you would have to do a modification on boundaries 12 down to 19 to actually move the boundary to the east of ST7, which wouldn't increase ST7 as an allocation, but it would move the boundary there, so the land in between ST7 and the settlement wasn't in the green belt. So it was just more a technical point on that. There's a slightly different take.
Well, look, I'll come to the council, but can I ask if that was done, and you did have that strategic gap, as Mr. Johnson referred to it, what policy coverage do you have for how that would be dealt with? Is this, because it's not clear to me that there's a strategic gap policy. How you'd need, if you did that, what Mr. Nakas is suggesting, wouldn't you also need to have something that, if you're doing it like that because it's a strategic gap and you need to maintain the separation, there would have to be something that kept it as a strategic gap. I'm thinking aloud in some ways, but I mean clearly Greenbelt would achieve that, but
yes, I think that's our point.
right.
In the circumstance of this case and the way that Purpose 4 has been applied, that would be the way in which the policy protection would apply. That's the instant reaction.
And a modification to include a general strategic gap policy would have potential implications around the entirety of the plan, and I'd be concerned about a modification which isn't necessary if it's within the green belt and our analysis is accepted.
And also there'd be a question mark in relation to Purpose 4, that we haven't then applied that appropriately.
Mr. Johnson, Mr. Nakas, was there anything you wanted to add?
Not a great deal, sir. I think we take the point that there isn't a strategic gap policy. It in part comes back to everybody's judgment as to what is the purpose of the land in between. We're not making a case for extending ST7 to become an urban extension. We accept that it is a standalone settlement and that somewhere wording would have to respect the gap. I think my point being is that if the site was larger, then the purpose of the green belt is somewhat diminished, but you could still protect it in the form of words. It may be white land, but it may be in the form of words within the actual allocation in itself. But I'm only suggesting this as an alternative as part of the boundary discussion. It's quite a larger alteration to the boundary discussion, but as I started off on this point, is that we are still prepared, if the boundary is not changed, is that we can work with these boundaries as shown in this plan. And it's perhaps something for you to take away rather than to become a major debate.
Sir.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Johnson. That's helpful.
Just
Mr.
to help,
Linus.
sir, in terms of other potential policy coverage, we've made our point on strategic gap, but be coming back later in examination sessions to policy GI1 and GI3 on green infrastructure. That's the only other policy hook we can find in the plan that may be relevant.
It would probably be a question of a new policy, wouldn't it? And I have seen strategic gap policies of different kinds, some of which look rather like green belt policy, some which look more stringent.
Yes.
Once you're into the territory of a gap for strategic purposes, then you're not simply looking at it as a material consideration in terms of the factors that go into the green infrastructure policies that we've already got about corridors and spaces, etc., but you're looking to create a particular marker and come back to the point, well, that's one of the purposes of the green belt, is to prevent that sprawl, prevent sprawl and coalescence.
Okay, is there anything we need to add on that little point then, or that point? Are there any other boundaries within Section 6 that anyone wants to raise issues around? Section 7 then. Are there any on Section 7? I think there are, aren't there, Mr. Key? Go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, my appearance today is really just in relation to the property known as the Retreat. And you'll have seen our hearing statement. We were last involved with this process in respect to this matter way back in, I think it was December 2019, when you may recall Mr. Ponter of King's Chambers in Manchester acted there. But I'm afraid you have to make do with me today. So we'll proceed on that basis. It's probably worth just first of all, just giving you a little bit of an update on the position with this property since we last appeared. At the time, I think Mr. Ponter made the point that it was, as you'll recall, it was originally built as a mental health hospital. It was it first opened in 1796, and it was very pioneering at the time in the treatment of mental health. Now things obviously move on, and it's very shortly to become entirely redundant. There are some clinical services still being undertaken in a small part of it, but the majority of it is vacant and has been for a while. The Retreat themselves as a Quaker organisation will probably continue in some respect in maybe one of the outer buildings on the site, offering clinical services into the future as part of the legacy for the site. But in terms of all of this, I think I'm really just bringing it to your attention for your background, and also because I noticed in the council's evidence that there were some references to this and what may or may not happen in the future. It's also worth you just knowing that we're in a contractual position with a specialist developer called PJ Livesey, who you may know are a specialist in listed buildings, and I'm sure you probably come across them elsewhere. So we're in that contractual position. We are engaged in pre-application discussions with City of York Council and painting broad brushes, but I mean, generally speaking, they are going quite well, and these centre around a sensitive residential conversion of the main buildings and the outer buildings. It may be the case as part of that we need to look for some new build on a small part of the site, either through enabling development or, as things currently stand, we would have to argue a very special circumstances case for that. That's an if at the moment, but I'm just putting it out there as the position at the moment. In any event, given that this is the first time this has been looked at in all these decades, we just, like others in the room, we just want to make sure that the boundaries are set right. So that's the sort of update. You will recall in the papers and the evidence that we've put forward in the most recent hearing statements we contained in our appendices, the submission that we put, it was quite an important submission for us, we put forward into the local plan proposed modifications and evidence-based consultation, which was back in, they're dated July 21. And in that, we included our own assessment of the site against the Greenbelt purposes, and we also contained within the appendices to that a document which I will ask you to, if you wouldn't mind going to in a minute, which is, I mean, it's this document. It's called a Landscape Appraisal and Openness Assessment that was undertaken by a local firm called the Landscape Agency. So I'll just take you to that in a minute. But this is just trying to cut through in terms of the purposes. This is really a purpose for situation. In the council's evidence, they do talk about purposes 1 and 3, but this is a in terms of sprawl and encroachment. But this is a previously developed site and has been since 1796, and it just happens to be an unusual property with a whole plethora of heritage designations. Just in terms, I just want to take you to this landscape document. It's in the appendices. If I can just, well, at the very least, give you some references to look at your leisure. Going to the key Greenbelt principles of openness and defensible boundaries, you'll see on page 23 the assessment, there's a plan there that is a kind of a guide to a number of locations around the site and views from them. And I would draw you in particular to what's called 02 and 06, which are then on the following pages. And 02 starts at the top of the site, and on the left you will see the boundary to the retreat, which is a very substantial boundary wall, which is grade 2-star listed, as everything is on the buildings and the registered park and gardens. And then at photograph 6, it shows, and in many ways this is a key. This is part of the key to this for me. It shows you looking from the more open greenbelt land way beyond in the Stray and looking back towards York, and you'll see in that photo the clear boundary wall to the retreat and the clear separation that there is from the wider openness beyond. And you see the University of York further to the right. And so I don't want to use today really to go over old ground. I mean, we've set out quite clearly, again, in the back of our most recent hearing statement, the changes that we're seeking in this precise location to the greenbelt boundary. We've put two possibilities forward. The first one is in Appendix 5 of our hearing statement, and that quite simply shows, for the reasons we've set out in our evidence and in the landscape evidence, the retreat excluded from the greenbelt boundary because of the openness considerations and the I think still confusion between the importance of the historical and conservation designations, namely the 2-star listing of the buildings and the 2-star listing of the registered park and gardens, and the protection that comes with that, versus the protection that comes with greenbelt and the going back to the basics of why land should be included in the greenbelt. The second plan is an alternative. And this is a judgment call, and I'll come to site visits in a minute, but it's a judgment call. And if you're not minded to agree with us on that, then the boundary, which is the next appendices, Appendix 6 of our hearing statement, is one where the greenbelt boundary continues all the way up to the retreat main buildings and goes across the rest of the site in a similar way. But what I would urge you to do, if I may, is really go on site with this, armed with in particular the landscape assessment, and look at this, because we think when you see it on site it's quite compelling, but that will be your judgment. More than happy to arrange proactively a site visit if you feel that would be helpful.
It absolutely would be, and yes, thank you for preempting that. Just to be sure, so the land that we would need to go on, is that all land within the ownership of the retreat?
Yes. So the alterations to the boundaries that we're suggesting in our hearing, yes, they are all in the retreat ownership. That's right.
Mr. Linus?
I'll ask Ms. Haley Brown to deal with the specifics, although I just ask you to note that at Appendix 3, page 726, the analysis in relation to the retreat does anticipate the possibility of looking at other alternative boundaries, but rejects them for reasons that are explained, including a boundary to exclude the whole of the retreat and its grounds from the green belt, and to use the outer boundary wall as the boundary, but rejected that on the basis of a strong historical and visual connection between the open character of the Stray and the situation and setting of the retreat and its grounds. But I can ask Ms. Haley Brown to elaborate on the reason for proposing the boundary as it's now proposed, rather than what is suggested by the objector.
Thank you. So Annex 3, the analysis begins on page 720. As proposed here, the boundary would be drawn relatively tightly around the built development of the retreat. There's a road that goes almost all the way around, not completely. That is a consistent approach with other buildings, including locations that we have spoken about today and yesterday. The analysis of this location shows that the area does indeed serve purposes 1, 3 and 4. I don't note Mr Key's particularly focused on purpose 4. And I say in this instance, the 3 criteria that the methodology looks at in purpose 4, all of which are met in this instance, and a difference compared with probably the majority of locations is that it includes the landmark monuments. And I note Mr Key suggested in matter statement and evidence now that the relationship with the listed building has been given undue weight. I'm not sure that's the correct way that you termed it, forgive me. But it's what I would like to say is the relationship with the listed building has been considered in relation to criterion 2, which is the landmark monuments, but also for purpose 4, the compactness and landscape and setting elements have been considered as well. So what I'm saying in that is the historic features of the site that relate to landmark monuments have been dealt with in relation to criterion 2, but it isn't just exclusively that, it is all of those 3 criteria for purpose 4.
Thank you. So we accept this as an area where a site visit is going to assist. Essentially, you have a debate over the land to the south of the retreat and its relationship with the retreat on the one hand, and on the other, the land to the south of the retreat and its relationship to the wider area and its role in the setting of the city under purpose 4, but other purposes as well. And really, that's just a matter of judgment that needs to be informed by a site visit.
That's right. No one, I mean, just to be clear, I mean, nobody, without wanting to list them, because we'll be here, the list itself is long, but I mean, it's grade 2-star building, grade 2-star listed park and gardens. The whole site's in a conservation area, and there are other listed buildings on the side. There's a scheduled ancient monument as well. Nobody disputes any of that. That's absolutely right. This is clear. I mean, this isn't a situation that you're in where if the Greenbelt designation were to be removed, then it could be a case that there'd be significant development here. That's not, I mean, those constraints in themselves are absolutely right. That's what they are. No one's suggesting otherwise. What we're saying is that the grounds of the retreat have always been the grounds of the retreats. It's since 1796, and their relationship in terms of functional relationship and use is with the retreat, not the wider area. And when you look at in particular the openness criteria of Greenbelt policy, and when you look at the evidence and make your judgment call, it's absolutely right that the site visit's undertaken, and my own view is that the evidence that we've set out, particularly in terms of the visual appraisal, is quite compelling. But you will make your own views.
Yeah, happy to do that. Site visit. That's
so I'll proactively organise that then. Yeah. Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Was there anything else from the council on this one? Thank you, Mr. Key.
Thank you.
Yes, your nameplate is there. Forgive me, I can't see it without my glasses, so do forgive me.
Thanks. It's Rose Hilton, Heslington Parish Council. We just wanted to talk about the parts of Section 7, the boundaries that go around Heslington Parish, mainly around Heslington Village and neighbouring areas. We've put in our hearing statement, which you'll have. Generally, we welcome the clearer boundaries around the built areas, which are understandable on the ground, and they make much more sense now than they did in a previous incarnation. I'm not going to go back to 1994. I'm far too young for that. But I can go back to 2018, which I think was when the draft was submitted for the local plan. And at that time, I think Heslington was identified in that figure 7 that you mentioned before as being totally within that open rural area. And it was the open area that would not be built on because of the setting of York. And that seems to have been followed through in the main. I'm trying very, very hard not to stray into matter 2, which we have coming up on Monday.
I'm keeping my eyes open and my ears open,
I know.
Mrs. Hilton.
But I do want to talk about the Greenbelt boundary 6 and 7, which is basically from Heslington Village eastwards along Low Lane. So that runs along the southern perimeter of Campus East. We think that that is a very good Greenbelt boundary going along Low Lane, and it links into what is an extension of Low Lane onto the footbridge over the A64. That's the section, that's the boundary 6 part. And in 2018, 2019, and even in 2021, the council have given very solid arguments about why that should be the Greenbelt boundary, including all the main contenders, the urban sprawl, protecting the countryside, the nature and character of York, and also the nature and historic character of Heslington Village, which is a separate settlement in a rural area. The land that is contained within the Greenbelt there below Low Lane, so boundary 6 and 7, definitely functions as the countryside. There are rural views all around it. The only non-rural view is the ring road. It's a food-producing area. It can function because there isn't urban sprawl at its margins. There's a clear gap between that area and any urban sprawling, including the Campus East site as is now. So it's not suffering from intrusions from urbanites like myself coming for leisure trips into the countryside, and therefore it's possible to farm it properly as a crop-producing area. And of course, importantly, we're wanting to prevent traffic flow through Low Lane into Heslington Village. That's not a green belt purpose, I realise, but it's all very closely linked in. So we think that the green belt boundary, the inner boundary for boundaries 6 and 7, should be kept along that southern Campus East boundaries, in other words, along Low Lane. Although it's actually moved in the 21 version, it's actually moved to the ditch just on the northern edge of Low Lane. I think that is fine as well. That's better, even. As long as it's a clear and defensible boundary. And in fact, in 2020, now which one would that be? 2019, page 385 of the EXCYC 18D, York Council did say that boundary offers strength and resilience to change. Unfortunately, 2 years later, they're planning to change it to put the expansion of the York University Campus East through it. But we're not talking about that today. So I'm not talking about that, although, of course, that would bring the Greenbelt boundary right up to the ring road, which is another thing the council had said they would not do. So, as I say, we hope that you'll consider keeping the Greenbelt boundary exactly where the council want to put it, which is for section 6 and 7, the length of Low Lane and up and onto the bridge over the A64.
Thank you. Mr. Linus, was there anything in that you want to address without sort of straying into next Monday?
I think that's the point, sir. I think really this is about ST 27. And for your note, the proposed boundary taking in ST 27 is dealt with at A3, 6, 8, 9 of Annex 3. But this is really bound up in debates over ST 27, which you'll be having early next week.
Thank you. Has anyone else got anything on inner boundary 7? Go on.
Thank you, sir. My issue is really around the lack of the lack of the council's evidence base supporting open spaces and green infrastructure. Now, it affects the land to the north of the university, to the north of the university campus, where I've put in my hearing statement, I've gone through several pieces of land there, and I've given some evidence as to why they should be classed as green wedges and green buffers, and a green corridor that's contiguous all the way out through the green wedges and green buffers all the way out to the ring road, and it joins in between Wongate Stray, which the council says is in the green belt, and actually Dean's Acre and Ponds Field, which the council says is in the green belt. So all of that land is land that fulfills greenbelt purpose and connects between two pieces of land that the council says is in the greenbelt and then goes out to the ring road. So I don't think it's possible to actually exclude land from the greenbelt by the greenbelt boundary if it fulfills greenbelt purpose and it's contiguous to another piece of greenbelt. Then I don't think it's actually possible that you could exclude that by a boundary.